Welcome, everybody. My name is Frances Hasso, and I'm a professor in gender, sexuality, and feminist studies at Duke University, with also appointments in the history department and the sociology department. What I'd like to do is just do a land acknowledgement that was crafted for Duke by Drs. Ryan Emanuel and Melinda Lowry of the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina. What is now Durham was originally the territory of several Native nations, including Tutilo and Saponi speaking peoples. Many of their communities were displaced or killed through war, disease, and colonial expansion. Today, the triangle is surrounded by contemporary Native nations, the descendants of Tutilo, Saponi, and other indigenous people who survived early colonization. These nations include the Haliwa, Saponi, and Okanichi Band of Saponi. North Carolina's Research Triangle is also home to a thriving urban Native American community who represent Native nations from across the United States. Together, these indigenous nations and communities contribute to North Carolina's ranking as the state with the largest Native population east of Oklahoma. What I want to do now is just thank Julie Winmore, Anant Singh, and Garrett Poulos, especially for their enormous advanced and behind the scenes today work on this conference. I'm grateful as well to my department as a whole, Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies, the Franklin Humanities Institute, and the Department of History for supporting and sponsoring this themed conference. Finally, I appreciate all the members of the Feminist Theory and Imperialism seminar from this fall 2012. This is our culminating event of the seminar. And now my colleague Anna Krylova will briefly introduce herself and introduce our first speaker.
Hello, I'm not presenting, I'm just introducing. So I'm Anna Krylova. I'm an associate professor at Duke in the Department of History, and I have a joint appointment in Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. I'm sorry, I can do that. So I work on 20th century Russia and the challenges posed in envisioning and building a socialist alternative in the age of industrial, post-industrial, and post-colonial modernity. It is my great pleasure to introduce Elena Gapova, and it is really, really great, Elena, to meet you in person. Thank you for coming to Duke. Elena is professor at the Department of Sociology at Western Michigan University. She was the founding director of the Center for Gender Studies at European Humanities University in Minsk, Belarus. Currently, this university is Belarusian University in exile in Vilnius, Lithuania. She has written extensively on gender, nation, class, and intellectuals in post-socialist spaces, and most recently on the problem of socialist and post-socialist nation building and the internet. She is the author most recently of The Classes of Nations, Feminist Critique of Nation Building, which was published in Moscow by the NLO Publishing House in 2016. And out of her numerous publications, I'm going to mention just the most recent, forthcoming one, and the most cutting edge, right? Activating and negotiating women's citizenship in the Belarusian anti-authoritarian uprising in Belarus in the 21st century, which will come out next year. The title of her talk today is When the Guns Speak, Feminist Discourses in the Time of Russian-Ukrainian War. Welcome.
Hello, and first of all, I wanted to say how grateful and honored I am to participate in this intellectually stimulating event. The title of my presentation is When Guns Speak, Feminist Discourses During the Russian-Ukrainian War. And this phrase, even now, 9 months later, seems somewhat unreal, though this is definitely reality now. However, it would be impossible to use this phrase in my part of the world, where what is going on is called special military operation in an attempt to conceal its nature. This presentation is very much a report from the ground, driven by the desire to register, to record, to remember, to be able to interpret feminist mobilization and social dynamics on both sides of the front line. as Russia claims that it fights against the United West, and Ukraine obviously sees this as a liberatory war. To generalize, Russian feminists rise against their government, while Ukrainian ones unite with theirs. The presentation will address some popular feminist positions and debates. I will also touch on some activist initiatives. The two are related, as online discourse is a mode of activism which tends to produce discursive change and real-world political effects and serve as a trigger for action. I go first to the Russian side. As the war began in February, protesters poured into the streets, and they were mostly urban, educated, cosmopolitan, often young. Many got their sustenance from global media market or projects coming their way through international feminist, human rights, ecological, or contemporary networks. The protest lasted for several days, but they were crushed brutally. And then protest mostly moved online. And you can see here two popular avatars which were used on Facebook and social media. One, this black square, and then the other one, which refers to the Ukrainian flag and the Belarusian flag. And immediately, feminists and women were thinking what could and should be done in the circumstances. Once again, it became too obvious what a gendered phenomenon war is. You see in this photo a group of Russian volunteers who help Ukrainian refugees. Well, it is well known that women are more active in volunteering, civic participation, and even fandom worldwide, and this is for a reason. Women are not included into power institutions and business structures to the same degree as men. Thus, for women, volunteering and participation in protests becomes a vehicle for agency, a way to come out as equal citizens and appeal to their full humanity. Second, and this is a Russian thing, for women this is less risky, especially after mobilization was announced in September. And I'm going to touch on three kinds of initiatives: feminist anti-war resistance, visible protest, and practical help for Ukrainian refugees. The visible protest is basically about spreading the word. Activists place all kinds of informational material and anti-war propaganda wherever they can, sometimes on banknotes. Take a picture and send it to a Telegram channel of the same nature. And some have already been arrested for doing that. Some, and this must be a woman's thing, place anti-war slogans on their bodies, perform their act and disappear, if not arrested on the site. These acts are designed to be photographed and put online and thus made visible. Some may become viral. Well, they can be seen as acts of disobedience and the elements of guerrilla warfare, and it can be discussed how public or private they are. But some initiatives definitely are more practical and focus on helping Ukrainian refugees who fled to or were deported to Russia to reach the European Union. And on this slide, you can see the map with the routes of escape, and a group which was formed on Facebook for so-called transit refugees, which helps them to reach European Union. They mostly collect money to buy tickets, and this is their appeal on Facebook. They collect money to buy tickets to bring refugees to European borders, and these volunteers quite often they act as the underground railway in pre-Civil War United States. When refugees are met at the train station, they are taken somewhere to take a shower, given food. Sometimes they can spend a night or several nights somewhere in one's place, in one's house, and then they are taken to the train station or to the airport and put on the train, and then at the next stop they are met by another group of refugees. But lots of Ukrainians find themselves in Russia. Either they were deported or they decided to flee to Russia because, well, this is they know the language. This is a very similar culture, and the deputy director of the Moscow Children's Hospice organized a refugee relief foundation titled the house with the lighthouse, where they collect money or collect some necessary things to help the refugees. You can see on this slide, you can see their appeal: a family of 4 from Zoom. Currently in Moscow, there are 3 children, aged 9 and aged 10. They're going to the 3rd grade, and they need a notebook or a computer to share. They need it for schoolwork. And then after mobilization was started, and once again, you can see the gendered nature of the war. This is Vnukovo Airport in Moscow, from where Russian men try to leave the country. These are the 2nd day, probably the 3rd day after mobilization was declared, and they try to escape the draft because they don't want to be involved in killing or in killings, or are scared for their own life. And anti-war resistance, the best organized as soon as this mobilization was declared, the best organized feminist initiative, feminist anti-war resistance, organized groups for women. They write, "We are starting an online group for Russian women whose family members have been drafted. These groups are free and run online by professional psychologists. One group helps wives and mothers who try to bring their family members back home from the army. These women need support, and we're ready to provide it. We adhere to the principles of confidentiality and are ready to provide help to any woman from any region. An online support group is a special format where one can live through one's situation among women with similar experiences. We are sure that Russian anti-war movement should be on the same side with those who became involved with the war against their own will." And several days or several weeks ago, a new initiative, a new anti-war movement was announced: the Union of Wives and Mothers of the Mobilized, and its ideology is ambivalent. Some of them are anti-militarist and oppose the war. Others are just legalist. They demand following the protocol and thus protect their male kin. And feminist resistance argues that these women are potentially an important resource. They write, "Many of these women began addressing the issue of war just now, when the war came into their own homes and the state has turned into an aggressor threatening their families. Yes, many of them have only now realized how terrible the war is. Many of them are amazed to discover that the government has been deceiving them all the time and uses them. There are social and political reasons for that, but now is not the time to discuss them. It is important that anti-war movement, and not someone else, stretches a helping hand to those women without any condemnation. These women, at least some of them, should join anti-war movement, or otherwise the state will know how to shut them up and pacify them." And there are ongoing discussions on social media and elsewhere whether this kind of work is meaningful at all. A feminist activist writes on her blog, "In Europe, I suffer bullying all the time, for Europeans believe that there is no anti-war activism in Russia. as there are no practical results. This initiative is a piece of evidence that something is being done. And in general, for Russian feminists, their goal is clear. They speak against the war, which they see as both imperialist and patriarchal. Now, moving to the Ukrainian feminist positions. This is, of course, a gargantuan task. Ukrainians tend to see themselves as a post-colonial nation. I'm not going into this discussion right now, but there are some implications, and this, as their narrative stems from a very different political position. This definitely as a special moment. And Ukrainian feminist critics used to argue, Olga Plekhotnik and Oksana Mayevchik used to argue recently in a context before the war, that as a post-colonial state, we cannot escape nationalism, as uncritical application of post-colonial rhetoric opens the door to the nationalist one. They introduce the concept of feminist time and the time of the nation and explain at some point in history, in the early 20th century maybe, Ukrainians and other rising East European nations used to see independence of the nation and emancipation of women as one or interrelated. That was a romanticized time of nation. And they go on to explain that these days, when this discourse is reproduced, it plays a different roles. For example, they argue that women's battalion called Zhenoche Sotnya during 2014 Euromaidan uprising did not oppose, but rather contributed to the hegemony of time of nation, simultaneously supporting and legitimizing the right-wing turn in Ukraine. And of course, this is a very dangerous, the time of nation and feminist time rising on behalf of the nation is very dangerous terrain, as can be seen in this musical video, which I cannot play right now for the lack of time. But here's the Ukrainian president proclaims glory to the nation, and the lyrics is based on the repetition of one line, you with dark browns, and Ukrainians are sometimes called the one with dark browns. You with dark browns make love to each other, but do not make love to Muscovites. And this goes against the background of soldiers marching. So, Ukrainian feminists call for war and appeal to nationhood, facilitating particular regimes of war. And this is something which at time of war is almost impossible to criticize. Thus, Ukrainian feminist scholar and activist Tamara Zlobina, unhappy about what she calls Western pacifism, argues that taken for granted feminist anti-military position emerged in a context. It has been advocated by feminists coming from imperial nations, which used to colonize, to oppress, and intimidate. Her nation, she argues, is waging a war of liberation, and women and feminists cannot follow this argument. She writes in May, it has been and I quote, it has been 2 months of the war, and I have seen 4 appeals by Western feminists against providing arms to Ukraine. These were Italian, German, and feminists from Spanish-speaking nations, and North American feminists added their voice to them. Their appeals read, we are against war, war is bad, these are men's games, we demand peace, we are against providing arms to Ukraine because it is going to escalate the conflict even more. These sisters, she argues, did not even think of consulting Ukrainian feminists when writing those appeals. It seems that all those renowned professors with life tenures in prestigious universities closed their eyes and made a wish that a pink unicorn would abruptly come out of nowhere. Pink unicorns do not exist, and in the same way, wars as men's games and patriarchal legacy that do not concern women do not exist either. And I continue. Western anti-military theory presents wars as something which is about two scoundrels fighting for resources. For example, ugly capitalist and imperialist United States fight against the ugly dictator Saddam Hussein for oil in Iraq, which is why it is necessary to disarm both sides and bring women into negotiations. For they, because of their gender roles, care about the future of children, while macho males only care about winning. Similarly, she writes, feminist foreign politics is about anti-militarist propaganda, empowering women and stimulating them to make peace. This is bullshit. All those feminists come from imperialist nations that have had rich colonial histories. Those Western nations where feminists have produced this kind of discourse for the last 30 to 40 years, they haven't had wars or revolutions for 70 years. Not one feminist professor had been in a situation when the war threatened her own life, or did not have her country occupied by an aggressive neighbor. This is a blind spot that turned a part of Western intellectuals into just chatterboxes. They totally missed such a phenomenon as the wars of national liberation. As a feminist, I say, arm Ukraine now. So this is one feminist position, but there's also the second side to this war. So there are now 8 million of Ukrainian refugees in Europe and Russia. Thousands of Ukrainian women are currently at the front, or volunteer, or contribute to the war effort in other ways. At the same time, there are about 8 million refugees and displaced Ukrainians, and they are mostly women with children and the elderly. There are very few men now who can leave the country. So put simply, women and children left, and men stayed to fight. And while this makes sense pragmatically, this division creates a patriarchal structure of dependence for women, as feminist scholars know only too well, and I refer to Carol Pateman and some others, myself included. Agency, which implies autonomy and recognition of a person as a member of polity and an equal partner, can only arise based on action and one's contribution to the common cause. At a feminist seminar recently, Ukrainian participants were discussing what repercussions this situation and this division of roles is going to have for Ukrainian women, especially now when the nation's infrastructure has been severely damaged and women have to carry the burden of care work. The main challenge now is how to realize and make visible women's public potential. And now, summing up a few words on the feminist solidarity or on the feminist lack of solidarity. 150 years ago, Marx and Engels argued in the Communist Manifesto that proletarians did not have a country. The oppressed, they would be oppressed anywhere. Their solidarity was supposed to stretch along class lines. In 1914, Lenin, the future leader of the Russian Revolution, called for the defeat of their government in what he saw as an imperialist war. At some point, he differentiated between imperialist wars and the wars of national liberation, of course. In 1927, Virginia Woolf stretched this argument to women, as she wrote, "As a woman, I have no country. As a woman, I want no country. As a woman, my country is the whole world." So these days, Russian feminists clearly rise against the war, their own government, and call for solidarity. They challenge their military state and patriarchal structures. Ukrainian feminists are in a very different position, seeking to be feminist and nationalist at the same time. And so far, they have been very suspicious of Russian feminists, showing a distrust in their efforts and often accusing any Russian feminist or not of hidden imperialist desires and agenda. So ideally, of course, it would be excellent if feminists on both sides of the front line would establish a connection For as Margaret Atwood argued, war is what happens when language fails.
What I'll do now is introduce Dr. Zhong Xueping, who is a professor of Chinese literature and culture at Tufts University. She completed her PhD in Comp Lit at the University of Iowa. In her 2000 book, Masculinity Besieged, Zhong uses a feminist psychoanalytical lens to examine representations of what she calls marginal male figures, anxieties, negotiations of sexual identity, and self-loathing in a selection of Chinese literature and film produced by male intellectuals during the 1980s. Her concern is especially with vocal writers and critics' responses to modernity with Chinese characteristics in that historical period, as male intellectuals made sense of where China might fit into the schemes of the modern world. In 2010, Zhong published Mainstream Culture Refocused, a book focused on serialized Dian Shizhu, perhaps the most popular and influential cultural form in China. Zhong uses these dramas, their subgenres, and song lyrics to examine the tensions and contradictions of the post-revolutionary and pro-market period in China. She shows how such productions express nostalgia and uncertainty, mirroring the social contradictions of the reform era. In our seminar, we read her essay, Women Can Hold Up Half the Sky. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Zhong Xueping, whose presentation today is titled Feminist Theory and Imperialism, a Class and Chinese Perspective, unquote.
Thank you very much, Professor Hasso and Professor Anna, for inviting me. What I have prepared may be a little bit longer than time allows, but I have tried to cut down as much as I can, and I will stop wherever when the time's up. In the past 40 years or so, especially since the introduction of the concept of gender into China in the early 1990s, scholars in China, mostly women and sometimes men, have continued to debate about how to understand Western feminism, especially in relation to China's Communist Party, CCP-led women's liberation. In the last 20 years, I myself have participated in conferences, workshops, and various forms of events in China in which scholars and critics carried out thoughtful and sometimes heated discussion and debates. A discussion forum held in Beijing in 2010, for example, was called Differences Between Socialist Women's Liberation and Western Feminism, Theory and Practice. At the last in-person event that I participated in Shanghai in the summer of 2019 before the pandemic, as another example, more than 10 scholars, including 2 men, engaged with the feminist China historian Tani Barlow's book, The Question of Women in Chinese Feminism, by offering their own take on, among other things, the notion of 妇女, woman/women, a term to which I will return shortly, in relation to a slew of other issues. Indeed, while like many other Western theories, numerous major works of Western feminism and theories have been translated and transmitted via active scholarly exchanges, for example, in China, since the start of the economic reform in the late 1970s, they have also encountered various forms of pushback, especially by women scholars who themselves have actually become quite well-versed in Western feminist theory. Against this larger backdrop in which one can find many connections to the central topic of this conference, I will offer some brief observations in the following. Despite the rather broad-sounding title of my presentation today, the particular perspective I evoke in the subtitle, A Class and Chinese Perspective, is where the point of my intervention will get specific. More to the point, I will revisit 2 Chinese terms, 妇女, woman/women, and 女性, female, and reflect on the extent to which their class implications and tensions within constitute a Chinese version of gender trouble for Western liberal feminist theory. Indeed, anyone familiar with feminist debates regarding the CCP-led women's liberation would know that in Chinese, there has remained an interesting tension between these two terms. Compared with their English counterparts, woman/women and female, 妇女 and 女性 in Chinese have more history-related political implications, and the tensions between and debates about them are largely oriented around how to make sense of those implications, especially in relation to the Chinese Revolution. Elsewhere, I have written about issues related to the tensions between the two terms in relation to the question of class. Today, I will continue this line of inquiry, but do so by focusing on the relationship between the class nature of the CCP-led revolution and the class implications of the 妇女女性 dynamics. In many ways, either implicitly or explicitly, the two terms have always been part of the language of class, characteristic of China's anti-revolutionary, counter-revolutionary struggles throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. Related to this point is an interesting question. If both these Chinese terms have albeit different class implications, why is it often the case that relative to 女性, female, the term 妇女, woman/women, especially in relation to 妇女解放, women's liberation, has encountered more feminist discontent than the notion of 女性, whose petty bourgeois class implications appear to have concerned many feminist critics much less. I will address this question by way of 3 points. First, the relationship between women's liberation and China's national struggles in class terms. Second, a brief revisit of the class revolutionary origin of the term 妇女. And third, the rise or the return of 女性, the word 女性 in class terms against the backdrop of the de-revolutionizing cultural turn in the reform era China. First, and applying the concept of catachresis in her seminal book, The Question of Women in Chinese Feminism, Professor Tani Barlow explores the ways in which terms of women and their rules of play, and quote, in modern China, produced the subject of modern women. As such, her study aims at pointing out the extent to which many different rules of play have informed the construction of the subject of modern Chinese women, that is simultaneously having become and still becoming. The concept of catachresis in this sense highlights both the dialectics and trajectory of the becoming on the historical, in relation to history. In the chapter titled Theorizing Women, Professor Barlow focuses on the historical catachresis of the word 妇, which means woman, and eventually links it to the development of the term 妇女, woman/women, in modern China. She notes in particular the term's trajectory in becoming, quote, a state category, quote, after the founding of the PRC in 1949, a point that in essence echoes many feminists' preferred identification of the CCP-led women's liberation as state feminism. What often gets elided in this focus on the connection between the PRC state and 妇女 is the connection between China as a nation and 妇女. What happens if we pair 妇女 with nation and highlight the connection between the two, premised on the class nature of both? Despite the well-known and debatable argument that Marxist notion of class was delivered to the wrong address, namely the nation, nationalism, an argument that has received much credence among some of the China scholars in the West. If one takes women's issues and women's liberation in China into their center vision, this argument can be shown to be narrowly construed and itself male-centric. That is, in relation to China's revolutionary struggles against imperialist aggression and colonial domination, and also in relation to the socialist goal of the CCP-led revolution, the term 妇女 in women's, as in 妇女解放, women's liberation, is in fact both classed and gendered. Let me elaborate a bit further. In his study that titled Mao's China and After, A History of the People's Republic, Maurice Meisner opens the book with the first chapter titled Western Imperialism and the Weakness of Chinese Social Classes. Short as it is, the chapter essentially situates the Chinese Revolution within the context of the class historical relationship between China and Western imperialism and class social conditions within China itself. Echoing Marx, Meisner sees Western imperialism as, quote, the unconscious tool of history, quote, in creating conditions for social revolution in China. At the same time, Meisner points out that in a semi-colonial country where the modern sector of the economy was dominated by the imperialist presence, it is hardly to be expected that the fledgling Chinese bourgeoisie could have been anything more than an extension of foreign capitalism, however much individual members of that class may have nurtured nationalist resentment against foreign domination, end of quote. The modern Chinese social structure, Meisner continues, quote, was thus marked by the feebleness of the modern social classes, a weak bourgeoisie, and an even weaker proletariat. But it was not only the modern classes who were puny. The modern Chinese historical situation was marked by the weakness of all social classes, end of quote. As a result, according to Meisner, the conditions made it possible for independent political forces, including China's modern political parties, the Nationalist Party, KMT, and the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, to operate not so much in representing social class interests as in determining the fate of social classes. That's according to Meisner. Coming from one of the few historians of China in the West with a Marxist stance, Meisner's equal opportunity assessment of the relationship between China's modern political forces, namely the two parties, and social classes, unfortunately reads a bit reductive, especially when it comes to him seeing the CCP mainly as an independent political power without its class identification. What does not appear to be central to Meisner's field of vision is the Marxist understanding of class as structure and as formation, and the fact that as a political force, the CCP was more attuned to the class nature of the relationship between China and the imperialist West within the historical context discussed by Meisner himself. In studying the revolutionary and socialist China and its post-socialist and counter-revolutionary transitions, Lin Chun, a Marxist scholar of political theory, has always been conscious of the need to understand modern China and the world, first and foremost in class terms. Her latest study of revolution and counter-revolution in China, published in 2021, begins with a theoretical assessment of China and class, but in a way that is more expansive than that of Meisner's. In the section titled Class and Nation, Imperialism, Nationalism, and Uneven Development, quoting Marx from Grundrisse, Lin Chun points out that the Marxian sense of the word compress is perhaps, quote, perhaps better than combine, as it captures both the dynamic process of temporal synchrony and the spatial unevenness of compressed temporalities, end quote. Within such compressed temporalities is the relationship between class and nation, in which she argues, quote, the ruthless hegemonic agenda of global capitalism is responsible for sinking a civilization of continental scope and unparalleled wealth, and the social and governing crises in a partially colonized China were directly attributable to foreign destruction, of which the astronomical war reparations imposed by unequal treaties was only one example. At the same time, being part of the weakest link in the global capitalist expansion, the revolutionary struggles that China took on and their class nature were conditioned precisely by this agenda of global capitalism. I quote again, as the declining Qing state fell prey to the capitalist jungle and nationalist struggles arose, China became, so to speak, a class nation in its global position. Now under siege by rival imperialist forces, the global recognizable class status of China gave its resistance a coherent character. It was this historical condition that compelled the party to be defined as an innovative working class organization in a new democratic revolution with a socialist outlook. This, the exploited and oppressed status of a nation in formation buttressed a collective self-consciousness in the form of revolutionary nationalism, end quote. It is in this sense, Lin Chun goes on to argue against the trivialization of the Chinese Communist Revolution, an approach that is, in her opinion, in common to both liberal revisionists and orthodox Marxist approaches. What is missing, she states, is the whole background of national and social crises that compelled a thoroughly revolutionary response in China. The class nature of this revolution, now coming back to the point, to the topic at hand, in relation to the Funyu, 女性 dynamics, would condition the class nature of the revolution-led women's liberation. That is, within the aforementioned compressed temporalities are also the Funyu, 女性 dynamics and dialectics, which are closely related to the class nature of the revolution and its women's liberation, and also its discontent. So my second point now, a brief revisit of the class revolutionary origin of the term Funyu. The word Funyu was the chosen term in the resolution on women's movement issued in 1922 by the then small and incipient Communist Party at its Second Central Congress. The resolution specifically noted that the overall revolutionary program would not be complete without the goal of women's liberation. It also stipulated, quote, the Chinese Communist Party considers women's liberation to be part of the laborers' liberation, 劳动解放. Only when the proletariat succeeds in obtaining political power can women be genuinely liberated, end of quote. After specifying three tasks of the time, I'm going to omit these, the resolution further stipulated that these, quote, these movements are mainly steps towards a complete liberation. Under the system of private ownership, it is not possible for the women to achieve true liberation, end of quote. Thus politicized in class terms, the word Funyu would go on to become a keyword in the Chinese revolutionary discourse, in and about which debates about its meaning has continued. It is important to note that calls for women's liberation did not start from the CCP-led revolution. If anything, layers of diverse views for change, either reformist or revolutionary, were already being expressed and argued by modern Chinese reformist and revolutionary intellectuals, men and women, at the turn of the 20th century. Here are two perhaps familiar examples. One is He Yingzhen, who is recognized by some feminist scholars as the first Chinese feminist. She wrote in the early 19th century on topics including the question of women's liberation, the question of women's labor, economic revolution, and women's revolution, and the like. In addition to focusing on how traditional culture controlled and constrained women, He Yingzhen astutely recognized the connection between social economic structure and women and questioned, for example, the economic and class status that belie the seemingly modern European women's freedom, a word, by the way, that she simultaneously evokes and interrogates. Leaning towards anarchism, He Yingzhen insisted that women must seek their own liberation without relying on men. At the same time, her arguments assert a strong social dimension in contending the importance for women to break out the traditional gender relations as a system in which women depended on men. Her attention to economic issues and her questioning of what she perceived as class oppression between upper class women and lower class women, and of what she terms as the sham freedom of European women, all mark the fact that from the get-go, Chinese feminism was birthed out of a social classed awareness that in many ways was theoretically uncompromising. Echoing He Yingzhen, among others, was this Lu Xun, known as the father of modern Chinese literature. Lu Xun is also known for his strong support for women's liberation and for his recognition of the need for a thoroughgoing revolution in China, only which would make a genuine women's liberation possible. So I think I'll skip, I'm not sure about my time, skip the quote from his lecture made in 1923 on the question of what happens to Nora after she leaves home. And in fact, this is actually an important part, but he mainly says, okay, I'll just quote maybe a few. He echoing He Yingzhen, Lu Xun asks, are you no longer a puppet once you have won economic freedom? His answer is no, you are still a puppet. It's just not, it's just that you are less subject to others' control and more in control of other puppets. In present day society, it is not only the case that women are men's puppets, but men are other men's puppets. Women are other women's puppets, and some men are even women's puppets. This is not something that can be remedied by a few women gaining economic rights, end of quote. Thus connecting women's liberation with the need to fight for existing, fight against the existing economic power structure, Lu Xun sees the need for a real revolution, a whipping in his word, even though he admitted he did not know how, when and how it would come. 100 years ago, since these 100 years since these revolution-evoking views on the women question, and decades since the Chinese Revolution and its accomplishments in women's liberation endeavors, the class implications in all of these arguments in relation to women's liberation are still relevant in our times. But the term 妇女, woman/women itself, however, has not aged as well. This leads to my third point, the rise and return of female, 女性, in class terms against the backdrop of the de-revolutionizing cultural turn in the reform era China. Coupled with the mistakes and calamities made by the CCP, especially during the Cultural Revolution, which eventually led to the opening up and economic reforms in the late 1970s, the CCP-led women's liberation, along with the term, would encounter much feminist criticism. There was, one can say, a gender turn in the reform era's assessing of this liberation. But all of this was at the same time accompanied by the retreat of the state from gender equality education and by a simultaneous advancement of, in Daniel Vukovic's words, liberal revenge, in implicitly and explicitly denouncing the revolution in total and by extension negating one of its most important accomplishments, namely women's liberation. Meanwhile, surfacing onto the historical horizon, to borrow a term from another seminal book by two Chinese women scholars, was the notion of 女性, specifically summoned back to replace 妇女 as a new critical lens. Through this new lens, the notion of 妇女 came to be viewed negatively, mostly negatively, for, among other things, its alleged basing on male standards when promoting equality between men and women, and for its alleged lack of recognition of the female difference. The introduction of gender into China in the 1990s, additionally, would further elide the notion of 妇女 as a feminist enough category. In addition to becoming a political suspect, the not feminine enough notion of 妇女 would also become an object for public ridicule. The term 女性, meanwhile, would reclass women's issues away from revolution into such domains as the feminine, the personal, the body, the desiring sexual being, and men's binary opposite. Here one might suggest so I will skip this and come to this almost last point. At the same time, in this post-women's liberation context in China, Western feminist theory has also encountered a kind of gender trouble of its own, when many Chinese women scholars have pushed back by way of their own take on the history and legacies of Chinese Revolution and women's liberation. One wonders whether this gender trouble, in essence, reflects a kind of class trouble with regard to Western feminist theory itself. In China, at least, the implications of the pushback, along with the 妇女, 女性 matrix, can be better understood in the context of the last four decades in which the market-oriented reforms have laid bare the consequences of the self-claimed socialist state's retreat in upholding women's liberation politics and policies, and of the advancement of the market economy and its capitalistic logic. So given the time limit, I'll end the discussion by circling back to the title of my presentation, and ask whether an insistence on recognizing the class nature of 妇女, as in 妇女解放 or women's liberation in China, and the class nature of the 妇女, 女性 dynamics related to the Chinese, also to the Chinese Revolution, might help generate or at least renew questions regarding feminist theory and imperialism. Here are just final questions. One, is there a gender dimension in imperialist history, and how is it related to its class and racial dimensions? In what ways has the divorce with Marxism hindered Western feminism and feminist understanding and theorizing on this front? How does feminist theory in the West understand and address the issues of imperialism without having to do so by proxy of anti-imperialism, imperialist revolutions and struggles in the non-Western world? And three, is it possible for feminist theory to contribute more to anti-imperialist struggles? If yes, how? If not, why? Thank you very much.
Introducing Dr. Maya Mikdashi, who is our next speaker and is Associate Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers University. She is co-founding editor of the website jadaliya.com and earned her PhD in anthropology from Columbia University. She is a recently published book author of Sectarianism, Sovereignty, Secularism, and the State in Lebanon, and she'll be mentioning some of those ideas in her talk today. I first learned of Maya when I watched a brilliant film she co-made in 2004 about Baghdad. And then, we also did an MA at the same institution, different years. She is co-founding member of the filmmaking cooperative Quilting Point Productions and director of Notes on the War from 2006. Her book, Sectarianism, focuses on the sectarian structure of the Lebanese state, where every recognized sect has specific laws that govern kinship matters, such as marriage and inheritance, which she argues help regulate and produce political difference. Mikdashi theorizes how sex, sexuality, and sect shape and are shaped by law, secularism, and sovereignty. In the seminar, we read Mikdashi's 2016 GLQ essay, co-authored with Jaspir Puar, titled, quote, Queer Theory and Permanent War, unquote. Her presentation today is titled, quote, Queer Panic, a feminist reading of imperialism and anti-imperialism discourse in the Middle East. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Maya Mikdashi.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to actually share my PowerPoint from now. And then, okay. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm really pleased to be in your company, and I really look forward to the conversations we're going to have. Thank you for having me. So today I will be sharing with you a feminist reading of a queer panic that had gripped Lebanon for over a year and has only intensified with the lead up to the World Cup. I'll be thinking with you about how the frames of imperialism and anti-imperialism are mobilized in these panics, and how, in fact, the mobilization of both imperialism and anti-imperialism as discourses are mired in what I call sectarianism. I'm interested in feminist readings of queer and anti-queer politics as sites of power, performance, and anxiety. So we'll be thinking about this panic and how it mobilizes the trope of imperialism at three different scales: the national, the regional, and the international. Now, by sectarian, and thank you, Francis, for that very generous introduction, I mean the articulation of political and sexual difference at three different levels: state practice, the discursive, ideological, and the geopolitical. I suggest that we're living in a world with intensifying sectarian understandings and feelings of political difference globally, regionally, and within nation states. This sectarian understanding of political difference traffics through and traffics in gender and sexuality, which is why I would say it is sectarian. How one positions themselves politically is increasingly through questions of sex and gender, and these political identifications are highly affective, hard, and identitarian. So, last year there was a lot, or 2 years ago now, in the United States, there was a lot of discourse that US political differences becoming more and more sectarian. And what they meant there was that the main sort of political divide here was becoming wrapped in identitarian and cultural and affective structures. In the case of Lebanon, sectarianism mediates national identity, religious pluralism, secularism, and political sectarianism, often through the device of what we're going to be talking about today, the moral sex panic. So here's the first scale. This past summer, in June of 2022, the Minister of Interior in Lebanon issued a circular directing the internal security forces to crack down and disperse any party or gathering, quote, aimed at promoting sexual abnormality. Following, end quote, following what the minister said were complaints by religious authorities about events and social media posts that promote, quote, perversion. This is the circular. The minister specifically used homophobic words in contradistinction to a speech by the Mufti of the Republic that circulated on social media beforehand, where he actually very carefully used the word mithliya, which is a word, the Arabic word for queer people popularized by LGBTQ activists in the early 2000s in the Middle East. In his speech, the Mufti claimed that civil heterosexual marriage and decriminalizing homosexuality were being promoted by, quote, outside forces, and vowed that neither would become legal. For those that speak Arabic, what he said was, لا زواج مدني اختياري أو إلزامي لا تشريع للمثلية. And here the Minister of Interior kind of one-upped the Mufti in his language, his use of pointedly homophobic language. Now, in 2018, the Catholic Church in Lebanon, perhaps the most powerful political religious organization, had used similar language to cancel a rock concert by a band fronted by an out queer man, Mashru' Layla. And this man is from a different sect and religion, which was part of the Catholic Church, was part of the panic whipped up by the Catholic Church. Now, this came after their concert in Cairo, which we will get to, but before they were banned from performing at northwestern Qatar in 2020 under similar discourses. In 2017, Egypt, 2018, Lebanon, and 2020, Qatar, the band's concerts and music were framed as dangerous and foreign to the nation. Now, the minister was promptly sued by leading LGBTQ groups and lawyers and legal activists who said that it was constitutional. The State Shura Council just 2 weeks ago seemingly agreed and froze the order pending legal review. But then the minister just last week issued another circular, this time under the guise of protecting queer people from what he said were legitimate threats against their safety. And he was referring, he was referring here to direct threats made by a chauvinist right-wing Christian group called the Soldiers of God, Jnud al-Rab, as well as other more indirect threats. Now, to understand this moment, in June of 2022, we could go all the way back to 1968. And the first time a law criminalizing homosexuality was proposed in Lebanese parliament. And even then, it was deemed ultimately unconstitutional and authoritarian by the judiciary, and it never reached a vote. But instead, I want to start in 2019. And I think in some ways, the hardest decision for all of us is always where to start, because each beginning is also an arrival point in history. And today, I want to start with the 2019 uprising in Lebanon, a mass cross-generational, cross-sectarian uprising against corruption and the political regime, an uprising that was able to mobilize 500,000 at its largest in a country of 7 million, and an uprising that this year is in its third anniversary, an uprising brutally suppressed both in action and in historical memory. So these are, and this is a documentary that had come out just a few days before the Minister of Interior issued his circular, and it was mostly filmed in Beirut. And this is the band that had been banned and that was kind of at that time in 2018. Now, one of the phenomena I try to understand in my book was why and how queer, migrant, feminist, and refugee individuals and groups played such a central role in this uprising, at least and particularly in Beirut, and what the central call of the uprising, a sovereign, strong state with a hegemony over political violence, sounded like from this voice or from the site of vulnerability And to understand and theorize the very different experiences of state power, for example, the experience of queers, feminists, migrants, refugees, drug users, the incarcerated, and the experience of those who thought of and experienced the state as largely absent and weak, I formulated the concept of an epidermal state. And here, this is a state that performs its sovereignty by materializing the intersectional stakes of bodies and sexualities through securitization, violence, and law. So why were queer people and feminists in their most vulnerable, and these are just signs of some of the graffiti that were in the uprising all over the city, why were they so really at kind of the forefront of the uprising? And I suggest they were at the forefront of the uprising because they had been living, feeling, and fighting against this epidermal state for decades. Now, the visibility of queer and feminist groups in the uprising did not go unnoticed by politicians who sought to use their presence and demands as evidence that the protests were radical and, quote, not organic to our culture. In fact, some influential political leaders, notably the self-declared anti-imperialist camp headed by a group called Hezbollah, have framed the 2019 uprising as, quote, the uprising of the embassies, and thus the latest example in a long history of the United States' attempt to definitively pull Lebanon out of the anti-imperialist axis and more firmly towards the goals of US empire in the region. In this discourse, NGOs and embassies are often equated. And the uprising in Arabic is framed as Thawrat al-NGOs, the revolution of the NGOs, Thawrat al-Safarat, the revolution of embassies. But all of this context does not answer the question, why would this circular, which is really, I really want to stress that it's kind of unprecedented, why would it appear 2.5 years later in June of 2022? And here, it's useful to remember what has happened in the last 2.5 years in Lebanon. After the uprising and after one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in the world ripped through the city. Today, 80% of Lebanon lives in multidimensional poverty. This number was about 20 to 25% in 2019. There's no electricity, there's gas and medicine shortages. And only 3 years ago, the dollar peg was 1,500 liras to a dollar. Today, last I checked, it's about 42,000 liras. So you can imagine what such inflation in the currency does to the entire life world. Now, even then, that summer in 2022, it was really surreal, given this context, to watch people who are living without electricity and amid shortages of every kind, who are locked out of their bank deposits, protests against queers and civil marriage in an area of Beirut that's marked explicitly Christian, and second, in an area explicitly marked Muslim, with the Muslim protests calling and commending their Christian brothers for their shared opposition to, quote, threats to Lebanese and Arab culture. And here, this is kind of the site of this protest. One of these protests, this is a, what are these called? Billboards by a group called Beirut Pride for Pride Month. And then this was the sort of Christian, radical Christian group that staged a protest and forcibly took it down. They're called the Soldiers of God. This is their insignia. And here I want to be, again, point out that Beirut Pride is very controversial in the Lebanese queer communities, and it's really split the communities. We can talk about that if people are interested, mostly because the organizer, in fact, is involved in marketing and had the trademark. So it's like a trademarked, it's trademarked in Lebanon. Now, in June and 2022 and in previous panics, queerness was equated with outside Western culture, and our national identity was understood as needing to be protected from this cultural imperialism, traveling through LGBTQ politics and sexual and gender politics more generally. And I really want to emphasize here that one of the benefits, or one thing that really stands out when we're thinking from the vantage point of Lebanon, is that you can really see how this discourse is both Muslim and Christian. So we could understand this unprecedented circular against queer spaces and directing security forces to shut them down within this framing of the uprising, collapse, and of a longer trajectory of queer politics and activism and their uneven relation to the state. In addition to how sexual and gender politics are staged through this imperial, anti-imperial frame. But now I want to complicate this picture a little more and offer another regional scale. So here's the second scale. In the years following the political uprisings that gripped the Middle East from 2010 to 2013, and they're ongoing, there has been growing securitization and state oppression of LGBTQ people in the region, coupled in many ways with the rise of LGBTQ activism and visibility during and after the uprisings, most infamously in Egypt, but also in Turkey, Lebanon, and in the Arab Gulf countries and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Queer dating and hookup apps have been closed or used to entrap people. Morality clauses have been enforced very heavily to close gatherings and imprison queer activists and queer people just sort of living their everyday lives. NGOs have been closed and threatened for violating public morality. Netflix's expansion into the Middle East, for those of you that watch Netflix, has sparked protests and public outcry in Egypt, Turkey, and Lebanon, and the Arab and Saudi Arabia for promoting homosexuality and heterosexual sexual debauchery. And it was framed as kind of this tool of Western imperialism to change Arab and Muslim societies. In particular, the rainbow flag has become a flashpoint in the region since 2017, and again, that same band, Mashrou' Layla's concert in Cairo, when Sarah Hijazi, a prominent Egyptian leftist and queer activist, was arrested for flying the rainbow flag. She was not the only one. An image that Egyptian media then turned into a panic. Of course, Egypt has an outsized influence in the region. She was imprisoned for 3 months for promoting debauchery and violating public morality, and she later gained asylum in Canada, where she died by suicide at the age of 30. Sarah Hijazi and her image at that concert, this is the picture that was taken, have become a rallying cry, an inspiration and a point of mourning for queer people across the Arab Middle East and its diaspora, partly because her life trajectory also showed that you can move, but there's no move without being uprooted and alienated. For many, including myself, her death and life re-signified the rainbow flag itself and turned it into a much more potent political symbol, despite the incessant media and political frame of the rainbow flag as tarwij, which is sort of promotion, and evidence that homosexuality is something foreign to the region, because of course the rainbow flag's genealogy comes back to the West. This has happened in Turkey with protests on college campuses, sort of looking where people who have the rainbow flag are immediately securitized, put in, taken out by the security forces. And it's happened also in Beirut and again, all across the region. And I suggest that the images that we just saw of the rainbow flag during the uprising in Beirut take on new meaning if we think of it regionally, precisely because for many activists, it has taken on new significance since 2017. Now, we could also end there with this sort of national and regional frame, but again, I want to complicate this a little more and bring in a third scale, the international, the geopolitical. Now, of course, we are now watching, we're all watching the World Cup. I'm certainly watching the World Cup. And that is this sort of third scale that I want to talk about for a little bit. Now, all of this was happening in June of 2022, and of course, June is International Pride Month, and in June 1st of that month, FIFA, which is the Federation for Football, put out a tweet around commemorating Pride Month with a big sort of featuring the rainbow flag. Also in June 2022, June 2nd, the US Embassy in the US, first, this was a US State Department, but the US Embassy in Qatar, Kuwait, and in Lebanon, and in Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, put out social media, a tweet, press release about the US government support for LGBTQ rights worldwide. And this is one of them here. This is the US Embassy in Kuwait. And this same tweet was also put out by the US Embassy in other Arab states. Immediately after this tweet caused kind of an outcry, the Kuwaiti foreign minister called in the US ambassador to discuss these tweets and the importance of, quote, respecting the laws and cultures of the countries that they are in. And here, this is just sort of, it's in, it was both in Arabic and in English. And here, I think you can clearly see how these social media representations really sort of sparked national discourses over national difference and sexual difference. And they really caused kind of a diplomatic scuffle. Now, all of this was happening right a week before the circular in Lebanon was released. Along with, if we remember what we just saw about the protests against the billboard in Lebanon and the documentary's release about the queer revolution in the Middle East. In June of 15, that same month, also 7 days before the circular was released, Saudi Arabia seized rainbow-colored clothing and toys. And Qatar, Kuwait, and Saudi also had done this a year before and again in 2022. So this is 2021. The Ministry of Commerce did raids in Qatar and seized toys with rainbow colors, saying that these were in fact signs of the rainbow flag and signs of harming the morality of children. And here, this is the video of the Saudi Ministry of Commerce released in mid-June of 2022 about them raiding and taking away toys and school supplies that had rainbows in them. Now, and right after this kind of panic over the rainbow flag that was in the Gulf, there are Lebanese companies that had, for example, a rainbow flag on a bag of chips, and they went and they changed the flag, the packaging of those chips. But when you think again from the position of Lebanon, all of these sort of entanglements are material. Lebanon's collapse, economic collapse, has made it much more reliant on other countries. Qatar sends over 70,000 tons of food a month to the army. Kuwait sends millions of dollars of food aid, and so does Saudi Arabia. And the United States, in fact, is the highest donor, sends hundreds of millions of dollars to Beirut, to Lebanon. The minister's circular was really a way for Lebanon to take a stance without really taking a stance, by focusing solely on LGBTQ communities in Lebanon and not addressing the US Embassy, which is actually what had made people very angry, including the Mufti. More personally, I think the Ministry of Interior was also sort of angling for political support to become prime minister. So then another sort of scale comes in, this kind of more ridiculous one. Here, the rainbow flag, the World Cup, the largest business event of the world, multi-billion business global sports event, and it's the first time it's held in the Middle East and in the Muslim majority world. And there are these sort of ridiculous performative practices of solidarity here around labor rights, human rights, that a lot of the teams are engaging in as they oppress queer and political rights at home. And, I want to suggest that this is also a frame we need to take into account. Globally, gendered violence is up. There's increased control over women's bodies. Women are losing in the economy. There's panics and regulation around trans people and trans life. In fact, the discourse of NGOs and of sexual politics being ways to infiltrate society and change it to become Western is a global discourse, even in the West. If you think about the Soros Foundation and some sort of conspiracy-minded theories, speaks of the Soros Foundation. Russia and the United States, often understood as rivals, and as Russia leading a coalition against US imperialism, are in fact both chauvinist political cultures caught in the frenzy of sex panics about gender, reproduction, and sex. So here's how I would suggest we read this one event, this circular that came out. And I think this is a sort of anti-imperialist, queer feminist reading that thinks through all these scales, the national, the regional, and the international. The circular comes at a time of deep crisis, after an uprising in which queer and feminist demands were hyper-visible, and a counter-uprising that framed it as from the embassies, meaning really the US embassy. In a time of national need for both material support and for political support, at a time of growing securitization after the Arab uprisings around and about the body, and a concurrent crackdown on queer life and visibility across the region, and indeed across the world. At a time when queer rights, visibility, and people are mobilized and as an imperial tactic of pressure, and are also mobilized by nationalist regimes as evidence of foreign corruption, and thus the need for authoritarian patriarchal securitization. At a time of increasing authoritarian populism that is chauvinist and that has contributed to state oppression and regulation against queers and straight women everywhere. So, and I'm going to conclude here, we can move from one circular, one page, that's my timer, one circular by the Lebanese Ministry of Interior, and we can read from that one page a world of political, economic, and geopolitical upheaval, moral and sex panics mediating this political upheaval, which is why I would suggest they are sectarian panics. And we can read this everywhere, from a street in Beirut to a soccer stadium in Qatar, to bathroom bills and groomer discourse in the United States, to a battlefield in Ukraine or a protest in Iran. Viewed from Lebanon, simplistic binaries between imperialism and anti-imperialism are not sufficient frames because of the multiple, nested, and competing imperial interest and would-be interest exerted on Lebanon. Moreover, when mapped onto queer politics and anti-queer politics, the frame pulls itself apart. Many of the countries accusing the United States of cultural imperialism via queer rights and shoring up their own sort of security apparatuses through this claim are in fact its closest allies in the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Lest we forget, Qatar is home to the largest military base in the Middle East, US military base. As queer and as trans people, as radical anti-imperial and anti-nationalist feminists, we are the first to be tokenized and the first to be abandoned within these frames of imperial and anti-imperial, and their sometimes mapping onto authoritarian and anti-authoritarianism in the Middle East. The stakes that we are having today in this conference are not theoretical or abstract. Instead, they are unfolding at the site of the body and its sectarian stakes every day, everywhere. Thank you.
It is my great pleasure to welcome Serene Khader to our workshop. She is professor of philosophy and women's and gender studies at the SUNY Graduate Center. She's also J. Newman Chair in Philosophy of Culture at Brooklyn College. In her work, Serene Khader explores the values that underlie feminist theory and political practice. Much of her research focuses on issues related to women in the global South. She's currently writing a trade book entitled The Freedom Myth, This book explores the following issues. Why kind of the following issue, why we need to stop thinking feminism's core value is freedom and start thinking it is equality. Her most recent book, Decolonizing Universalism, came out with Oxford University Press in 2018. There she asks what values should guide transnational feminist solidarity and shows how feminism can respect cultural and religious differences and acknowledge the legacy of imperialism without surrendering its core ethical commitments. Her talk today is Feminism is not about freedom. Thank you, and let me.
Thank you so much, Francis and Anna, for inviting me. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay, just checking. Oh, but now I have it in presenter view. Sorry about that. Okay, thank you so much, Francis and Anna, for inviting me. I am super delighted to be with you guys. When I saw the syllabus for the course attached to this, all I could think was that I wish I could take the course. But since I can't take the course, I'm excited to be with you. I have learned a lot today from the very textured case-specific presentations that we've heard so far, and I've really, I have learned a lot from them. I'm saying this also, though, to say that my presentation is going to be a little bit different, and part of the reason for that has to do with my disciplinary background. For those of you who are in the course, you're aware, and also based on Anna's introduction, you know that I am a philosopher, and much of my career has really, and partly because of the methods of my discipline, I have been very interested in saying, like, let's look at these very textured, case-specific writings in the history of anti-imperialist feminism, and then say, because I'm a philosopher, I have often wanted to say, let's step back, let's zoom out to the very big picture, and let's talk about what we can learn from them at a relatively high level of abstraction, but not for the purpose of being abstract, rather for the purpose of being able to be kind of clear about what our commitments are, and ideally with the hope of guiding practice. So with that kind of piece of intellectual autobiography in mind, the big kind of question that I have been interested in answering in recent work is, what's the cause of feminist complicity and imperialism? And just to give you a sense of where I'm headed, I want to say that actually one of the big reasons that Northern feminists and Western feminists end up participating in imperialist practices is that we/they are committed to the wrong values. And just to kind of give a preview also, in Decolonizing Universalism, which you guys read a part of, one way to think of what the takeaway message of that is about values is that the reason feminists become complicit in imperialism is that they're too attached to a certain ideal of freedom. And the trade book that I'm writing that kind of says that feminism isn't about freedom is basically designed to say we will actually gain a lot in terms of an anti-imperialist feminist praxis if we adopt a shift in values where we focus less heavily on freedom and return to the idea that feminism is a movement against inequality. So that's where I'm headed, but let's start with the question. So what causes feminist complicity and imperialism? As you'll see on the slide, the first thing is obviously feminist complicity and imperialism is caused by interests and power. I don't want to deny that. I have, but I'm a philosopher, written in parentheses here just to say this is the most important thing to talk about. It's just not the thing that my disciplinary expertise is going to make me focus on talking about. Instead, I want to say that, or in addition, I want to say that there are these intellectual habits or practices or vices that encourage feminist complicity and imperialism. And I think that these intellectual vices or mistakes are of two types. In the piece that those of you who are in the class read, you saw that I believe that much of the cause of feminist complicity and imperialism is a set of epistemic habits, right? Like a way of framing knowledge about the world. In the piece that you read, you one of the things that you saw, I know it was at the beginning of the semester, but I think that a lot of what causes feminist complicity and imperialism is this thing that I call the Enlightenment teleological narrative, which is basically the idea that the West is more advanced than other countries because of endogenous features of the West and not because of the history of colonialism. Part of that is the adoption of what I call, following my late colleague Charles Mills, an idealized social ontology that understands the world as divided into cultures. And as Uma Narayan famously argued, this type of culture talk effaces the history of imperialism and geopolitical concerns. I also think that one of the imperialist epistemic habits that drives feminist complicity and imperialism is what I call moralism, which is basically the treatment of the domain of politics as a place to take, as a theater for kind of moral grandstanding. So I'm not going to say more about that because that's kind of a summary of the piece that you guys read for the class, but I just want to connect what I'm about to say to what you have already heard. So when we want to know, and we're looking at intellectual practices, what makes feminists complicit in imperialism, I think part of the story is that there's a sort of constructed ignorance that is constituted by these imperialist epistemic habits that blocks apprehension of what the reality of or the realities of women in the global South are. In addition to that, and this is what I want to focus on today, I think another reason that Western and Northern feminists end up complicit in or actively supporting, in many cases, imperialism is that they adhere to mistaken normative or moral beliefs. So all that I mean by normative or moral here is beliefs about value or beliefs about right and wrong. I don't mean anything stronger than that. This is important because, I'm going to say that it's going to be an important part of my view that feminists adhere to certain normative and moral beliefs. That doesn't mean that they believe any kind of very specific moral thing. It does mean, though, that if you're committed to the idea that gender injustice is a form of injustice, or just the idea that there are bad injustices in the world, then you're already, from my perspective, engaged in the domain of normative or moral theorizing. So I think that feminists become complicit in imperialism partly because of mistaken normative beliefs. And I want to contrast that view with, I think, the dominant way of talking about why Western feminists become complicit in imperialism, which says that moral universalism is the cause of this complicity. So because I've devoted a lot of my career to this and wrote a book about it, I have a lot of kind of cantankerous complaints about the idea that universalism is the cause of feminist complicity in imperialism. I'm going to go through just a few of them here, and I'm not going to do any of them a great amount of justice. But I just want you to have some sense of where I'm coming from. So one problem, I think, with suggesting that universalism or universalizing is the cause of feminist complicity and imperialism is that it conflates the issues of domination and power with issues about difference, right? It reduces what I take to be often material interests and psychological interests in dominating other people and reduces them to discomfort with difference. I think that's a bad and distorting move for a lot of reasons. One of the biggest ones being that the history of colonialism is actually not a history merely of discomfort with difference, but of a more kind of constant encounter with, including often fascination, fetishization, et cetera, of difference, not just the inability to cope with it. My more, and this is kind of the second point on your slide, my more kind of cantankerous annoyances with the idea that moral universalism is the cause of feminist complicity in imperialism is that I honestly think that it can be an intellectually lazy way of engaging with literatures and practices of women from the global South, women of color theorists within the global North, and so on. The basic reason why is that I think that if we just treat all of these theorists as anti-universalists, we miss the fact that they are often making positive claims about what we ought to have instead of the universalism that they're criticizing. And we miss the fact that they are often criticizing Western and Northern feminists for having the wrong values. So if we are against moral universalism, actually, the ability to say that we end up kicking out from under us the ability to say that Western feminists are wrong. And we end up kicking out from under us also the ability to say, well, actually, there are a variety of different other normative and political positions that are being developed by non-dominantly situated theorists and activists. What the universalism discourse does, I think, at the end of the day, is just make us focus all of our attention to focusing on the difference between this set of theorists and the West, rather than ever paying attention to their individual specific intellectual projects and political projects in their own right. Okay, I could talk about my reasons that I think it's intellectually lazy or potentially racist for a long time. Let me also just say that if we say that that all of these theorists are just anti-universalists, we end up conceding that the ability to theorize about the universal is something that only Western people are engaged in doing. And the most cantankerous point I want to make about my frustration with the universalism talk is just that I'm not that young anymore, but I am young enough that my entire kind of academic career, including, when I was my undergraduate education, like included lots of texts, even within philosophy, about the call to listen to the other, and that what was important in reconfiguring Western feminism was to be open to difference and aware of what others were saying. So I believe that critique is absolutely important. My cantankerous sort of point is that call to listen to the other has been going on for 30 years. The next step in doing responsible intellectual work is looking specifically and concretely at the contents of that call rather than just repeating the call over and over again. Although it also can be important to repeat the call to people who have not heard it before. Two more kind of quick reasons that I'm dissatisfied with the universalism talk, and then I'll move into my view. Radical and decolonial movements have often been universalist movements. One obvious example of this is the extent to which many of them have been Marxist. Marxism is undoubtedly a universalist strand of thinking. Another example, just to plug a book that I really love, Adam Getachews' World Making in the Age of Empire, is a book about how Pan-Africanists were interested in remaking the global order as a whole, not just in forging very specific projects that were local to their context. And finally, just one last reason that I'm dissatisfied with the universalism talk is that I think feminism, and this is going to be an important part of my view, feminism is incoherent if we can't appeal to cross-contextual values, right? Like, we are engaged in a movement against injustice. If we really believe that there's no such thing as injustice, then it's going to be a little bit more than a little bit difficult for us to try to fight against injustice, and in particular, since we're anti-imperialist, to argue that the form of injustice we call imperialism is wrong, or that Western or Northern feminists are wrong. So let me shift, now that I have kind of spent some time talking about my frustration with the imperialism talk, and say a little bit about my kind of, or about the universalism talk, sorry. And let me just say a little bit about my positive view about one of the very important reasons that Western and Northern feminists end up engaged in imperialism, promoting behaviors and intellectual exercises. And to put it simply, I believe that imperialist feminists are often motivated by the wrong values. Like, they believe that feminism is something, and the thing that they believe it is effectively mistaken, right? Like, I want to say they're wrong about what feminism is, And the way that they are wrong about what feminism is in fact causing harm to other women. So in particular, what do I think that these Northern and Western feminists are wrong about? Well, I think morally they often believe that feminism is the pursuit of individual freedom for women, right? Like it's the extension of the value of individual freedom to individual women's lives. This and the trade book that I'm writing right now kind of extends this into the idea that we believe that it's individual freedom from social norms, that feminism is about freeing women from tradition and so on. But basically, my view is if you think feminism is about individual women's pursuit of freedom, you will end up with a feminism that ends up promoting imperialism for a few different reasons. So one reason that I just want to lay out here is that it causes plays what I call a justificatory role in imperialism, which is your third bullet point on this slide. So basically something plays a justificatory role in imperialism, in my view, when it makes imperialist action seem like it's beneficial. So an obvious example of this is that is how freedom talk is often used to explain why it's acceptable or just the feminist cost of doing business to erode women's relations to their culture. So to get even more concrete about this, like I think discourses about Muslim women, for example, are often shot through with versions of the claim that, oh, yes, feminism is going to require reducing the connection of women to their culture, they're wearing cultural symbols, they're believing religious beliefs, but that's just fine. And that's just what feminists have to do because feminism requires individual women to pursue freedom. Tradition is preventing individual women from pursuing freedom. So any kind of cultural costs that are imposed on Muslim women start to look like they are just collateral damage, the feminist cost of doing difference. Yeah, if people's cultures have to be destroyed in order for feminists to win, well, so be it. And I think this is actually a position you're starting to see a lot of feminists in Europe in particular explicitly take, right? Like it's, yeah, feminism is going to require cultural destruction. Well, if that means I'm an imperialist, so be it, I'm going to bite that bullet. I also think that the idea that feminism is about individual freedom plays a constitutive role in imperialism. My view is basically that individual freedom, to the extent that it's valuable, may be valuable primarily in a certain moral language and in a certain moral context. So it may be the case that individualism and individual freedom in particular are very valuable in the global north or in the United States in particular. It doesn't follow from that those things are an important value in everyone's life. So I also want to say that this individual freedom-focused feminism plays a constitutive role in imperialism. And by that, I mean that spreading individual freedomism in the name of feminism is a way of promoting cultural domination or the domination of Western values or their hegemony across the globe. I'm going to skip a slide because of time, but I don't think it's actually that important for our purposes. So you might wonder, and people often wonder, well, if feminism isn't about individual freedom, what's it about? And I think there's actually a pretty straightforward answer to this question. And it's that feminism is opposition to gender-based oppression. So what's oppression? Because obviously this is where the action is going to be. Because if you think that oppression is just deprivation of individual freedom, then my view is going to be incoherent. But I actually don't think that that's what the tradition of feminist activism and practice suggests at all. Instead, I think, and here I'm going to borrow a definition from the philosopher Marilyn Frye, but I think it's both relatively non-controversial and the transnational feminist scholarship kind of repeats versions of this claim in describing what feminist movements as opposed to women's movements have in common across borders. But the basic idea is that oppression exists when a society is structured so that one group benefits from the disadvantage of another group, right? So society has a structure. The structure ensures that one group or some set of groups will get more while other groups get less. So part of why I think that's really, really important is that if you think about it, the value of individual freedom doesn't really figure in feminism very much at all. Like, if you think that feminism is about ending group-based inequality, you can actually divorce feminism from a lot of the views related to individual freedom that end up being imperialism causing. So just, I want to see if I should go back to that slide. Okay, so I want to say, and I'm going to go back a little, and I just want to say a little bit about what the value of kind of de-emphasizing individual freedom might be for an anti-imperialist feminism. So first, kind of off the bat, if feminism isn't about freedom from tradition, culture, religion, etc., then this opens up space for what I think many feminists in the global South and women of color feminists, Black feminists are already doing, which is advocating for reductions in gender inequality for communal or tradition-based reasons. So the freedom feminism kind of creates this tension between feminism and culture, right? It says, like, the way that you become feminist is by abandoning culture. But I think if you shift to saying, well, the real issue is whether cultural, traditional, economic, whatever practices subordinate gender groups to other gender groups, then the question about whether the practices come from tradition or religion becomes irrelevant, right? Like, we just can, like, the feminist question isn't like, does this practice have a traditional origin? The feminist question is just like, does this practice subordinate gender groups to other gender groups? If it does, it's a problem for feminists. If it doesn't, then there may be lots of reasons to keep it intact or to reform it in ways that are still consistent with maintenance of cultural or traditional beliefs. Another thing that I think we can get, and this is the second bullet point on this slide, that I think we can get from dissociating feminism from value for individual freedom, is that then it becomes much easier for us to go directly to looking at forms of structural inequality that are the real cause, or are, now I'm showing my cards a little bit too much, but are a major cause of gender inequality. So one of the things you often see in anti-imperialist feminist scholarship is a claim that, look, Northern feminists are engaged in stigmatizing cultures when they are, when they look for sources of gender inequality. If they aren't stigmatizing cultures, they're stigmatizing Black and brown men. And they're really kind of single-minded focus on this makes them lose sight of other structural phenomena that are drivers of gender inequality, like the gender division of labor, like militarism, like the ways environmental degradation affects women's labor burdens. If we're only looking, when we're looking for things that feminists should oppose, for constraints on individual freedom, it's going to be very natural to focus on things like tradition, culture, individual men. If we instead are looking for patterns of structural inequality, it becomes a lot easier for these other phenomena to emerge as central phenomena for feminist concern. And also, to kind of more provocatively, it enables us to say back to feminists who are so focused on individual freedom that actually the political practice that they're engaged in is sometimes really missing the forest for the trees, that they have set their priorities incorrectly if they're not able to look at structural phenomena kind of first and center, and structural inequality as front and center. I think I have like 1 minute left, but I think rather than running through more material, because you guys have been listening for a long time, I'm just going to stop because I think there's more than enough to chat about. Yeah, and so I'll wrap up there.
So we've set a 10-minute time limit for each of our remarks, me and Anna, which means we can only touch on a few ideas we brought into the seminar and the enormous learning we did with 7 other seminar participants as we worked through 12 weeks of material. We plan to write an open access essay that better develops the major ideas, so please consider these comments as works in progress. Okay, I'm starting my timer. I have about 25 years of research, teaching, and governance work in US women's studies, gender studies, sexuality studies programs when one includes graduate school. This experience includes pedagogical and intellectual efforts to transform curriculum, design syllabi, and produce and engage with knowledge in ways that extend theory and scholarship by using, among other things, transnational, feminist, anti-colonial, and anti-imperialist analytical lenses. I came to realize that Anglophone feminists and queer academia and activism largely reproduce the power and interest of our imperialist countries. This seminar and theme year emerged from a desire to work through my increasing sense that English language feminist scholarship, theory, and teaching, broadly conceived, reproduces US imperialism, and this is a feature rather than an easily resolved quirk or mistake. Excellent feminist scholarship has already shown us how reactionary political projects, including white supremacist, sexist, homophobic, colonialist, imperialist, authenticist, nationalist, sectarian, secularist, racist, or religious, with particular historical and contextual characteristics, often mobilize the woman question and a range of sexual, sartorial, and gendered signs, relations, and ways of being to legitimate social and economic organization that is unequal at best and repressive at worst. I always assumed that sex is one dimension at the heart of imperialism, and we have a lot of great scholarship that shows this. In the seminar, we came to understand that the imperialized are interpolated by and respond to capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism in a variety of ways that negotiate with power, but are not necessarily resistance. We talked about resistance as collective or individual projects backed by collectivities focused on transforming or ending repressive systems or building new ones. Such approaches to resistance are not reflected in the most foregrounded Western feminist theorizing. This was a puzzle we repeatedly revisited. Since the early 1990s, and anticipated earlier, I would argue, with the rise of gender and sexuality as a focus of institutional concern for the United Nations, are feminist and queer perspectives and projects that explicitly or inadvertently reproduce the imperialist order by the white supremacist capitalist global north, and especially the United States. We face directly in the seminar the related hegemony of English language feminist theory that counts as theory and scholarly production. The seminar was concerned with how pro-feminist movements of a variety of stripes, non-governmental organizations, states, corporations, and foundations mobilize the woman question and sexual, sartorial, and gendered signs, relations, and ways of being to reinforce world-level extractive and repressive social organization. While some of us recognize how the US State Department, USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, and major foundations and corporations engage in such mobilizations to maintain hegemony, it may be less obvious how the best work in the field may also reproduce a certain we-ness that is embedded in and reproduces the same material relations and ideological field. One consequence is to reinforce reactionary projects determined, at least rhetorically, to guard sexual and gender authenticity, along with cultural autonomy and political sovereignty. Right political projects increasingly mobilize gender and sexual conservative values, often associated with the foreign and the West, as we heard today, in anti-imperialist, culturalist, and sovereigntist terms. To some degree, this is the other side of the coin of liberal or progressive gender and sexual values, riding in vehicles owned by capitalist and imperialist forces that also privatize our own and other countries' institutions, maintain hundreds of military bases around the world, forever wage hot wars, impose deadly sanctions on 1/3 of the world's population, and persistently work at dividing the world, including outer space, into 12 or 13 commands for US imperial power. These same powers have always encouraged and protected, it should be noted, global North white missionary projects, usually profitable, with reactionary gender and sexual agendas in global South countries that allow them to enter or cannot keep them out, even as progress pride flags flutter on, for example, US embassy buildings in many foreign capitals today, ones I've seen this summer. Little space is left for communities and societies to determine their dynamic forms of life and relations that include, but are by no means limited to, affirming and inclusive gender and sexual relations, or to use a framing from over a decade ago by Nancy Fraser, to address questions of redistribution and recognition, as well as other material, cultural, and symbolic concerns. What are the stakes, we asked, in directing our attention to culturalist, symbolic, and identity frames to the exclusion of the multidimensional sources of suffering and thriving in all communities, which must start at very material levels, such as the ability to breathe, to have electricity and clean water, to live in a warm or cool house, to have green spaces, to have healthcare, to have good food, to learn, to associate freely, to be able to think, to create, to love. I have been on a journey to rethink notions of sovereignty, not in Westphalian terms, which is a fiction saturated by different forms of power, but the idea that communities living in particular places and regions have within all of them the knowledges and resources to determine and struggle around how best to organize and change their societies and relate to other societies, to their neighbors, and other forms of life and environment. Here I have been most informed by indigenous political movements and scholars around the world. How do feminists want to address sovereignties and borders? Do we want to reject them given actually existing concentrations of violence in the world, and when many people are demanding the ability to make decisions that prioritize their human and ecological well-being in ways that align with their resources and priorities, but do not align with the priorities of imperialist forces? We considered what knowledge making looks like in a multipolar world not dominated by capitalist, imperialist, and racist global North powers. This vision would go well beyond geopolitical multipolarity to include an epistemological and ontological reorienting that recognizes multiple sources of valuable knowledge, experience, and history. Think here of Sylvia Wynter, who we read, Cedric Robinson, shout out to my Millennials Are Killing Capitalism book group, Mao Tse-tung, and thousands of others, living and ancestors, most of them not lettered, famous, or peer-reviewed, but grounded in communities and transformative projects. We privileged imperialism rather than empire in the seminar, or we privilege theorizing that emerges from messy, concrete relations within and between societies. We face directly people and institutions that consolidate power and resources and the locations where this is done. We considered why the most widespread theoretical tools at our disposal, especially since the early 1980s in global North academies, so easily turn our attention away from these systems and locations. Taking lessons from Samir Amin, we considered imperialism as inherent to capitalism at formation. We considered by corollary how much of Anglophone feminist scholarship, often built on conceptual and theoretical universalisms, always ready to cross borders, reinforces US-European imperialism. With some exceptions, and I think of Leila Fernandez's work here, even global feminist scholarship often ideologically reproduces liberal and war-making capitalist relations and assumptions, but in subtle ways. we discussed how culture, art, and intellectual production is shaped by and largely reproduces its ideological and material ecosystem, but how our training directs us away from such questions, especially in how we understand and make claims, especially in how we understand, make claims about other societies. More surprising is how we seem to think ourselves in our work as above and beyond these contexts. So I will stop here because I'm basically done, and Professor Verges is here. So now Professor Verges will give her comments. Thank you very much. Oh, I'm introducing her. Okay. Sorry, I'm introducing her. Okay, I need one. Okay, so Professor Verges, give me a second. Okay, so I'm going to be very brief. So because I'd rather hear her and you'd rather hear her. Dr. Francoise Verges is a widely published scholar and illustrates the logic of theory, practice, revision. That was my timer, revision that I will discuss in my own remarks later, which I did. I talked a little about Mao. We read 3 chapters from 3 of her books, ranging from 1999 to 2021. And she has like one book that's just come out that I won't talk about now on violence. And she has another book forthcoming from MIT Press on ecology and feminism and war. So I think instead of reading my 1.5 page comments on Dr. Verges, I would rather have her start talking to us. Welcome, Francoise.
Hello, do you hear me? Hello?
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Good day. As I say, I'm quite sick and I won't be able to talk for long. I caught a cold in the plane and I'm coughing and I'm quite in a bad shape. But nonetheless, I will use my 15 minutes or a little more than that to give an intervention. And thank you for inviting me. Well, my title was Permanent War and the need to revive a feminist international for peace and against imperialism. I mean, war being waged. I mean, war, when I talk about the state of permanent war, is not that I think it's very new. War has been waged against Black, brown people, indigenous people for a century. So this is not what is new. But what is new, I would say, it's compounded today with the climate disaster and also the fact, of neoliberalism and more imperialism. I mean, the economy of extraction, the economy of dispossession is reaching every corner of the world. And when I talk also state of permanent war, of course, I'm not just talking about the war, with the armies and bombs and tanks, but I'm talking about increased poverty, extraction, pandemics, sorry. The structural adjustment program which led to the end of public services, education, health, and everything. And so all this, being attacking people from everywhere. And this in that women and children are the first victim of all this multiple assault coming onto them. So I've been thinking mostly recently, beside this form of imperialism, of the right to breathe. Of course, I can breathe. We remember it from Eric Garner and George Floyd and others, but also, this was police violence, but also everything that makes the world irrespirable and uninhabitable. What imperialism is making the planet uninhabitable for billions of people and irrespirable for people. Irrespirable here, I don't mean only, of course, censorship, dictatorship, form of fascism, whether we call it neo or post-fascism, authoritarian capitalism, and other form, but also the fact that because of the economy, capitalist economy, air is more and more polluted and more people are dying or polluted air than any other cause every year. So the air is really literally made irrespirable. That means that there is really an attack on every, like, of course, human and non-human life, because without oxygen, we human die, but also plants and animals and bodies of water. So there is, and this is not just, how can I say, unexpected consequence of extraction and dispossession, but really, this is the continuity of these politics that lead, to polluted air. And also that for children, all more Black and brown children are born with restricted lung, with more respiratory disease, with more difficulty, and then which lead then to asthma and other lot of problem, which mean that really the lungs of the planet and the lungs of human are being attacked. And this is for me what is imperialism also about today. It's not just about the land, it's about also, the fact that we cannot breathe, that the right to breathe has become a revolutionary right, a struggle, a revolutionary struggle. And the second thing I wanted to say about imperialism is also this, so, and the polluted, sorry, I'm going back to the pollution, air pollution, is also, of course, provoked by all the wars that are going on. We know that in Iraq, in the south of Iraq, more and more children are born with leukemia because of what the US Army left behind them, in terms of polluted soil and polluted air. So this is, the question of contamination, of pollution, and remind me, of what Césaire said in Discourse on colonialism, the way in which, this is what it's being done by what he called then colonialism and imperialism, of making the life impossible, making really the life impossible. And this is, this idea of extraction through suffocation and exhaustion has been with us for a long time. It started with slavery, went on with colonialism, and it's today with imperialism and liberal, sorry, neoliberal capitalism. The second remark I wanted to do also about that was this economy, that's the economy of suffocation and the economy of exhaustion. The fact that more and that people are exhausted, billions of people are exhausted. There is mental and physical suffering going around the world and attacking effectively the life condition of people. So this is really the enemy, that fabricating, premature death all around the world. I mean, to use Wilson Gilmore, definition of racism as the fabrication of vulnerability to premature death. So this is what I see everywhere around now. And it goes with also the increase in, military spending, increase, in military base around the world, which bring with them, imperialism, military base, which bring with them also a lot of suffering for people around and contamination of land and soil and land and water. I'm really sorry. And so this is, the state of permanent war. It was also because I started to think recently about the fact that peace has been quite abandoned as a demand. Peace used to be a revolutionary feminist demand, used to be, a mobilizing word, campaign. And peace has become now today as if we renounce struggle against imperialism, that as if we are naive pacifists. And we don't know, that sometimes struggle need to be armed struggle. But this is not the same thing when we talk about revolutionary peace, how to bring back peacefulness, what will be to build, what will need to build really a feminist internationalist movement for peace, for revolutionary peace today. And this revolutionary peace, as I say, is not just, the peace, this moment that men sign around the table, which is in fact ceasefire. What has been, called peace for a long time now is ceasefire, since, World War II and the war that the West waged on people in the global South, without really a moment of respite, from 1945, 49 to today, people in the global South have known, war, but economic war, cultural war, and also armed, struggle. So to go back to this question of what I talk, like the need for building a revolutionary movement, feminist movement, international for peace, was to reappropriate this term of peace, peacefulness, and revolutionary peace. What I mean by that is really that fighting against military spending, fighting against, the fact that arm industry are really dictating a lot of policies today. The fact that seas and ocean are more and more militarized, that there is no freedom of circulation, neither on land nor on water. Everything is being controlled and managed by the army, and a whole, economy of surveillance and drones and other things, satellite. So there is this, for me, fighting for peace is fighting also for this freedom of circulation from people of the global south that are being more and more locked and forbidden and die in the seas, in the Mediterranean, in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, or in the Channel, or along the borders of Europe. And with that, the multiplication of what Frantz Fanon called the zone of non-being, and that we are seeing right now in Europe, that we saw last year at the Belarus-Poland border, but we are still, seeing it. This zone where effectively the life is made like hell for people. And I'm thinking of when I say what happened on the border of the Belarus-Poland border, last December, when thousands of refugees from Afghanistan and Africa and Iraq and Syria were caught between two borders and between two armies, and that the European community called it the hybrid war. So the refugees were transformed into, the soldier of an hybrid, arm for an hybrid war, and that gave legitimacy to the Poland and to the Belarus government to attack these people. So this multiplication of zone being in the middle of Europe, which has always thought about itself as the land of peace since the end of World War II, because it's handlessly externalized its wars outside France or, Great Britain and others externalizing their war in Africa and Asia. But now it's in Europe itself, the zone of non-being, and this camp, the word camp has come back. And this is a loss, and this is when, when imperialism is also when power is just, its goal, it's just more power. And this goes to the entire violation of any right. Nothing is being left. And this combination of what we see, not only in Europe, but also we see in India and other places, of this combination of the form of fascistic thinking with imperial, and that is the response to imperialism led by the US and whatever. It's really concerning. It's really of concern, because there is no place where we can think. I mean, then there is no government, global South government, most of them are either weaponizing anti-Western discourse, but in fact to censor and crush their own people, but also to manipulate, on the geopolitical place, like a seat among other people. So we are confronted, if we want revolutionary peace, with a new, nonetheless, world, a new mapping in which we have to both fight against imperialism, US imperialism being the one that nonetheless still brings the most suffering around the world, but also for revolutionary peace. And revolutionary peace, there is no country, no place now that really, offer that. But people on the ground, community, movement, that are really trying to reappropriate that, to reappropriate peacefulness against imperialist politic of death, because imperialism has always been the politic of death. So my proposal when I suggested that talk in this conference, which I'm really sorry not to be able to attend and to listen to many of the intervention, has been this concern against this state of permanent war and how it's going to become. So it's getting everywhere in the world, and that need. I was talking recently with very young women from Iran, refugee in the mountain of Armenia. And they were they were telling me, and I was asking them what will they need? And they were saying that they needed effectively that some solidarity. And so that term of solidarity, that to revive it also and to bring it back also political content. And not just, so the question about feeling close or interdependency, but real solidarity. Because interdependency, we can see it also, it's a form of community, strong community. We can see it also on the other side. So what we need is, beside community building, is really revolutionary solidarity, and that fight for revolutionary peace against the politic of constant war being waged by government and imperialism against people and community, indigenous community, queer, trans people, feminists, women, anti-gender politics around the world. I'm sorry that I won't be able to speak much longer. I feel that my voice is going to be, I'm not going to stop. I'm being able, sorry, I'm no longer being able to speak. And I'm really sorry to, give you that terrible, contribution with an absolutely broken voice. I'm really sorry.
No, thank you very, very much, Dr. Verges. And actually, it wasn't a terrible contribution, and I'm glad you made it. And I'm sorry you're not feeling well.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah. So I think what we'll do now, if you'd like, you can, if you'd like to stay on, you can turn off the camera and listen to Anna's comments and leave when you like. If we know you're on, we'll direct questions to you. If you're not on, that's okay. We really appreciate
I will have to leave because I was able to, get an appointment with the doctor to give me some things.
Yes, and we know it's very early there. Thank you very much. Okay, so Anna, yes.
Okay. Are you recording this? Okay, great. Thank you. So I want to thank our presenters for sharing their generative work with us. And since I have only 10 minutes, and I know that Francis is very strict, I will comment only just on one set of questions that these presentations have highlighted. So if I needed to give my comments a title, I would have probably called them Feminism, Western Feminism and its Analytics. So because I had to make choices, my comments mainly relate to Serene Khader's and Francoise Verges presentations in this workshop, but they are in conversation with all workshop presenters who have published extensively on the subject of feminism and its analytics. So, and I also want just to situate myself, geographical, methodological, and theoretical very briefly, so I don't count this to my time. I'm a modern Russian historian. I'm a historian also of the Soviet Union and Soviet and non-Soviet encounters with socialist and socialist feminist projects in the 20th century. I'm also consider myself an intellectual and social historian interested in questions of historical theory. So one of the questions I ask is what historical inquiry can contribute to critical social theory and feminist theory, and how can we use, and I believe actually we must use history as a theoretical resource. So let me now formulate my set of questions as follows. And actually, we're speaking very different analytical languages, so I'm going to use my own analytical language, and I'm going to start with a very simple question. How do scholars situated in the institutions of higher education, in what I'm going to call here the collective West, imagine and write about the rest of the world? In particular, what kind of topics they choose to cover, what interpretive categories do they choose to deploy, what narratives they end up constructive and perpetuating when they write about humans and their predicament in the world produced and reproduced by colonial, imperialist, post-colonial, and most recently, neoliberal legacies and histories. So what does feminist scholarship have to say in this regard is a particularly thorny question, because feminist scholarship, as our presenters have long argued, is by no means a stranger to the ideologically encrypted analytics of contemporary academy. So the rest of the world that I have just casually used as a category, kind of as a term, is of course a very vague figure of speech. In the decolonial feminist and Marxist literature, the rest of the world has resided under many names. The third world, the global south, the two-thirds world, or we can actually follow Eric Dirlik and approach the north and south global divide as a metaphorical rather than geographical distinction, where north refers to the pathways of transnational capital and south to the marginalized poor of the world, regardless of geopolitical distinction and geographical, it's actually geographical distinction, sorry. So, and I cannot resist and draw a striking parallel between Dirlich's proposition and a much earlier Bolshevik Marxist vision of this vision of divided world that was part and parcel not only of the Bolshevik critique of global capitalism as the highest stage of imperialism, but also part of Soviet popular culture on the eve of the Second World War. For example, one can find this vision in 1936 bestseller, a military novel by a well-known Soviet writer, Pavel Pavlenka. The novel was called In the East, Na Vostoke. So in the novel, Pavlenka invites, and by no means shocks his readers, to imagine the borders of the first proletarian state, the state of the oppressed, as having nothing to do with what the author calls conventional geographical lines. In the novel, when the, it's a story, it's an imaginary scenario, when the Red Army responds to the unprovoked invasion by Japan and extends its counterattack beyond Japan, it doesn't invade enemy territory. According to Pavlenka's map of the world, when the Red Army enters the impoverished districts of giant capitalist cities, the field soaked with peasant sweat, it only liberates its own territory, not an enemy territory. So everyone knew, Pavlenka wrote about the liberating proletarian army, that the Soviet border was not the conventional geographical line that exists in maps. The actual border was different. It was invisible, and because of it, even more real. It ran across the globe between palaces and huts. And I will finish Pavlenka's thought. This invisible border simply basically retraced in his imagination pathways and circuits of transnational capital and economic, racialized, and gendered inequalities that capital creates. Right. So in the remaining 5 minutes, I would like to share my thoughts as to why I believe over the past 30 years, it has become more difficult in social sciences to take a note and write those overarching, structuring, and constraining pathways of transnational capital and power relations it propels into histories and analysis of the global South, whether we define the South as a geographical destination or along the Dirlich and Bolshevik lines as a socioeconomic position in relation to global imperialist structures of power and oppression. So who's to blame for this state of affairs and what is to be done? There's a kind of inherent continuous Russian question. So to begin answering the first question, one would need to carefully examine the 30-year-old encounter between the contemporary academy and post-structuralist theories of society, power, and subjectivity. The history of this epistemic remaking is something that, that I have been interested in for some time. So let me start by making what I believe to be a non-controversial starting point as a beginning for my investigation. That post-structuralist radical rejection of what was called at the time totalizing habits of thought has cast a long shadow over contemporary social sciences and humanities. In the 1980s and 1990s, this critique of totalizing frameworks was specifically formulated against simplified, and I would argue, non-existent Marxist tradition. And the resultant elaborate critique of totalizing forms of knowledge did lead to the subsequent move away from what at the time was also called top-down analytics. That is the study of large-scale structures and regularities that undergird and constrain humans' day-to-dayness without making any formal announcements about their defining role in their lives. Actually, this is basic Marxism, right? So the consequences of this scaling down analytics have been far-reaching and lasting, and we should not underestimate that. This is how, for example, Kathy Weeks has recently summed up this development just on account of feminist theory, which I will paraphrase here. So having eschewed large-scale structures and social totalities, feminist theorists have embraced a new mandate to pluralize and specify, to drill down to the particular and the subjective. So the focus of feminist theory, as a result, has turned from regularities to singularities, from commonalities to difference, and from business as usual, which is the routine of everyday life, to states of exception. So I would like to further this critique and comment on what has happened to the concept of power in the course of a post-structuralist upgrade of analytics and social sciences. Let us look, for example, at the Foucauldian dictum of power is everywhere and there is no center to power, which has undoubtedly taken a life of its own in social sciences and in humanities across, and also even in popular culture. So this kind of dictum has also produced rather unanticipated effects. For example, it has helped and in fact commanded scholars to disengage from earlier conceptualizations of power as centralized, concentrated in state-like and extra-state institutions. And at the same time, it has allowed us to discover humans' endless resourcefulness to resist power, because power is everywhere, and wield power by simply living their lives or struggling through their lives, like resisting, subverting, contesting, sometimes modifying conditions of oppression, but operating within structural constraints of oppression, which usually are not even mentioned in scholarship. So as I have written elsewhere, power as a result can now be handed out liberally to all humans, regardless of their positionality within local or global structures of domination. So to avoid any misunderstanding, by no means am I suggesting that historians or social scientists are unaware of larger oppressive structures that circumscribe people's lives. But what I'm saying is that social scientists can now empower the disempowered, basically without doing anything, regardless of oppressive structures, even if those structures proceed with their business of oppression as usual. So today, as I look back at the past 3 decades, actually in my case, 20 decades, not just 3 decades, right, that I'm just rushing through here, I'm struck by the telling irony that I have been discussing with the seminar, namely that it was precisely when in the name of neoliberal liberation of humanity, the power of labor was curbed, whole sectors of economy privatized, markets deregulated, welfare safety nets undermined or thrown away, that the discipline of history, which is my kind of mother discipline, and social sciences and humanities found a way to empower humans virtually in any societal position, no matter how underprivileged, exploited, marginalized, and impossible to survive those positions actually were. So in conclusion, and I'm basically, I don't know how I'm doing, perfect. So in conclusion, so the persistent forgetfulness, and actually I'm still looking for a term. So this persistent forgetfulness on the part of much of mainstream social sciences to treat structures and regularities of oppression, to a failure to treat structures of regularities of oppression as the first paramount step in one's contextualization and analysis, has been most recently empowered by this post-structuralist informed configuration of our analytics, devalorization of some concepts and categories, and reconfiguration of others. So what is to be done? I'm going to say the obvious that if we want to counter this recent de-radicalizing, de-revolutionizing developments in our modes of analysis, which to various degrees are present in all disciplines represented here in the workshop. And if we want to continue building the emancipatory theory for the 21st century, we absolutely need to reclaim and further develop those concepts and analytics that have been marginalized and chastised over the last 30 years. So this work of reclaiming and scaling up has already started, as the panelists' presentations clearly show, and their published work that we have been reading in the seminar. And I very much look forward to our conversation beyond my comments. Thank you very much.
I want to thank everyone who was here, who left and came back, people in the online audience, and especially our guests, Elena Gapova, Xueping Zhong, Maya Mikdashi, Serene Khader, and Francoise Verges. Yes, and Francoise, and also the seminar co-participants and my colleague Anna Krylova. Thank you, everybody, and the staff. It's a wrap.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye.